Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, just when you thought Milwaukee Bucks were full strength, we get dealt a piece of news on a recent podcast. We'll get into that and what it means for the Bucks rotations as we move into the playoffs. Will we see Pat Beverley again in a Bucks uniform this season? We'll open up that conversation and take a look at the final 10 games the Bucks have remaining, as that loss to the Lakers left the door open for those teams chasing the Bucks. So what's the realistic chances of the Bucks holding on to the 2 seed, and what will they need to do to secure that? We take a look at the scenarios coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis, who you can hear on the Technical Foul podcast and the Carry the G and MKE podcast as well. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and viewable as well on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Grammarly. Make a bigger impact at work with Grammarly. Sign up and download for free at Grammarly.com/podcast. Camille, we hinted to the injury news at the top of the show as just when you thought you had emerged from being a team that wasn't full strength, we get dealt with the news that Pat Beverley is going to be on the shelf. So you played the game against the Lakers without him. And Doc Rivers was asked about his status before the game, and specifically, when this injury occurred, how severe it was, did not have an answer for either of those. And then a day later on the Pat Bev podcast, we hear it is a torn ligament in his wrist, and said the timetable he was given was 3 to 4 months. He did make it sound as though he's more than willing to play through the pain and just give it a little bit of rest. So we'll see if that's what's going to happen here. But not the news you wanted to wake up and find out. In that, look, it's not Damian Lillard. It's not any of your big four. But I think what Pat Beverley has brought to the defense on the perimeter has been a big boost for this team. But maybe even more importantly, he's kind of been a coach on the floor, in that he knows exactly what to do under this Doc Rivers system. And he's been able to help out those guys in those spots he's been on the floor, not even just the game time, but when we've seen Pat Beverley on the bench as well, calling out instructions to his teammates.
I'll be the first one to admit, when the trade was, when it happened, like, okay, we're getting Pat Bev. I was like, wait, this is it. This is the only move that we're making. And watching him play and how he integrated himself into this team and what he's been able to do. You mentioned him having a familiarity with Doc's system and how Doc wants to play. If you ask Pat Bev, I saw his presser the other day where he mentioned the off ball switching. He's like, that's my defense. Like, I did that. Like, that's me. And just the energy that Pat Bev brings to the second unit, as well as just the defense. Like, we saw it, him getting 2 blocks in the same game. Like, he can make an impact on the game, even if he's not scoring. He's also a good facilitator for the most part. He's trying to find the mismatches. He's trying to set guys up. And the Bucks have been short at that point guard position. Understanding that Pat Bev isn't your traditional, like, I'm going to initiate the offense every single time down the court type of point guard, but yet and still, he is the only backup point guard on the roster. So losing him for any period of time is also going to just kind of be a little bit more disjointed. I'm sure you'll see the ball in the hands of Chris or Dame or Giannis more with that, but you're thinking the second units now, and it's like, okay, we're going to do a Giannis plus bench or a Chris plus bench. And those are going to be the guys now really tasked with initiating the offense and getting guys together. But we have seen, and I was also confused at why Doc kept saying point guard Pat Connaughton, but we've also seen the ball in Pat Connaughton's hand a lot more often. So we might see that more going forward while Pat Bev is recuperating. But like you said, it sounds like he's planning to play through it. He's going to take some time, according to him, and what we heard on the podcast, he's going to take some time to rest a little bit, but he's going to figure out a way to play through it. And he mentioned, like, he didn't think that it was going to be that severe of an injury when he got it. He's like, it's a little pain, but I didn't think it was going to be a big deal like this where I need surgery and it's going to take 3 to 4 months. But I don't think we've seen the last of Pat Bev if he has his way and how he plans to try to play through this injury. But I'm also not a doctor or sure, like, what is the injury risk if he continues to play with this sprained ligament in his wrist? What will that do? So on and so forth. And I would believe that the Bucks wouldn't put him out there as well if it's going to be a danger to himself. So we'll have to see how it actually shakes out. But I love that Pat Bev is like, I want to play. I plan to play. Like, I can figure this out. So maybe there's a good middle ground they can find, which, I mean, for the Bucks, you hope so. He is a valuable piece to this team.
You love it. You're also not surprised by it. Just seeing Pat Beverley's personality and getting to know him since he's been here in Milwaukee. But speaking of those two Pats, you mentioned point guard Pat in terms of Connaughton, 9 assists last night or 2 nights ago in the game against the Lakers. That's going to be a big piece for them, certainly. But look, for all intents and purposes, we've talked about this throughout the year too, even before the Pat Beverley trade. When healthy, Chris Middleton is basically their backup point guard, and he's been the guy that's been playing with the bench units the most, or it's been Chris and the bench, and he's led that group as basically the point guard, set them up offensively. He's been the go-to scorer there as well. And look, once you get to the playoffs, as Doc Rivers even joked about earlier, rotations are going to trim down. When he was asked something about, why'd you go 10 deep? Like, well, because it's the regular season. It's not the playoffs yet. So those were going to come down again if you can stay healthy. So it is a loss to not have Pat Beverley, assuming you're going to go a stretch of the playoffs without him. But it's not a massive loss in terms of what you would lose in your starters. It's not to take away from what he's brought to the team. But look, if you picked any of the top, and I shouldn't even word it that way because nobody's going to choose, I want this guy injured, but it's more palatable and sustainable to have that as the injury. And in some ways too, as we constantly cling for reminders, and man, this is just like 2021. I know it didn't happen in the postseason, but part of it reminds you of the injury to Dante DiVincenzo. And I know Dante was starting, but in terms of their role, pretty similar with those teams. So he had said, Pat Beverley did, that it happened on the dunk that he attempted in warmups against the Thunder. And that, as you mentioned, it's not substantial pain. There is a little bit of discomfort. And when he took that first 3-point attempt against the Thunder, he felt something, but it wasn't like, oh man, I got to come out of the game. So I am going to be curious to see if this is hey, he's shut down for the rest of the regular season, maybe the first round or more of the postseason. And then we think it's rested enough that he's going to have surgery in the offseason, but he's willing to play through the pain. He'll play through the pain. The big part of that is, look, I think regardless of the injury, in the minutes that he was on the floor, especially if those were minutes with, say, Dame Lillard and Giannis and Chris, Pat Beverley was going to be the guy that was going to be left open by opposing defenses anyway, but especially knowing that, and I would assume he'd be playing with some type of wrap on his wrist, he's going to especially be left alone defensively. So that's where you would get into the dilemma of a lot like what we saw, again, with a guy he was drawing comparisons to in 2021 in PJ Tucker, in that, look, you know what he's bringing defensively, but on the offensive end, we're just going to let him be. So that is the challenge of, I understand you want to play through the pain, but you may put us in a precarious spot if that's the case.
Yeah, and if that is the case where the offense is going to be so very limited, then the question becomes, will the defense make up enough for that lack of offense on the other side of the ball? Because when you think of Pat Bev's bag, and I'm not trying to diminish it, but when I think of how he generally gets his buckets, it's normally a 3 or it's that floater. He loves going to that floater. And I do wonder, I mean, when you have a sprained ligament in your wrist and you're trying to get your floater off, like how limited is that move in your arsenal now going to be when that's also one of your go-to moves that you like to get to? So when I'm thinking about Pat Bev's offense, the 3 stands out for sure, but I'm thinking like normally if he's driven off the line, he's going in for that floater, and I'm not sure how effective that's going to be with the wrist or how the pain is going to affect that. But again, if the defense can make up for it, and given the minute loads that we'll probably see Pat Bev in the playoffs as well, to your point about the minute minute allocation going up for the starters and getting into playoff mode. We'll see what that looks like. Like, I was surprised that Jay Crowder only had 18 minutes against the Lakers, where I was like, this feels like a matchup where he could have gotten 25-ish minutes throughout it. So it'll be interesting to see which way they go with that. And Jay is somebody whose shot has been falling a bit more consistently in the month of March, which is a welcome sign after how he was shooting coming back from the injury. So maybe you see more of that. Maybe it's like we kind of just tweak how many minutes it is that Pat's out there because we're using him in defensive spurts more than we were previously before he was hurt.
So for at least the time being, it appears Bucks are going to be playing without Pat Beverley. The injury report, I think, still had him listed as questionable with a wrist sprain, so it hadn't been updated to reflect any type of tendon issue and out for sure. But Pat Beverley is not going to play in the game against the Pelicans, and again, probably not for the remainder of the regular season and then some. When we return, though, speaking of remainder of the regular season, I do want to spend some time taking a look at these final 10 games that the Bucks have left. How much that loss to the Lakers may have hurt the Bucks in their chances of holding off teams like the Cavaliers and the Knicks for that 2 seed. So we'll take a look at those final 10 games, and the same for those teams that are chasing the Bucks. Who's the biggest threat, and what do the Bucks need to do in terms of win-loss to hold on to that 2 seed? We'll open up that conversation coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked out for this week on the eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Player of the Week. And the one that stands out the most, maybe I'm being a prisoner of the moment here, is DeAndre Hunter, the only forward left standing, it seems like, for the Atlanta Hawks. So for the time being, he's seen an increased role. And look, we've seen with that increased role some increased confidence as well, taking that ill-advised three-pointer, albeit he knocked it down. But that three-pointer that helped seal the game against the Boston Celtics just the other night. And you're going to have to find scoring somewhere in Atlanta. DeJounte Murray has had some big games recently, but they're still playing without Trae Young, and still no official timetable on his return. So DeAndre Hunter, one of those guys that is going to continue to have more and more opportunities here for the playoff bound, or at least postseason bound, 10th seeded Atlanta Hawks. Josh Lloyd from Fantasy Basketball, Locked On Fantasy Basketball, is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. It is no different with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, it is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It is now also available on Amazon Fire TV in the free TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today, it's here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with the local experts you've come to expect from Locked On, plus all of our national shows that get into every single league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. So, Camille, as we take a look at the standings here, the Bucks are still 2 games in front of the Cavaliers. They're basically 2 games up on everyone when we look at the loss column. 3 games up on the Orlando Magic. They're interesting for reasons we'll get to in a moment. But you're 2 games up on the Cavs, 2 games up in the loss column on the New York Knicks. You do hold the tiebreaker against the Knicks, and you have 1 game left against the Knicks at home on April 7th. You'll hold the tiebreaker regardless of what happens in that game. but you've lost it to the Cavaliers by way of your divisional record. So Cleveland has been on a bit of a skid, and a lot of that has to do with health. We've seen Evan Mobley in and out of the lineup. They're still playing without Max Strus. Donovan Mitchell, the big piece that has been in and out of the lineup as well. So their health has seemingly been fading of late, and they still have an easier remaining schedule than the Bucks. All of these teams do, to be clear. But the good news for the Bucks is it's no longer the Bucks in the top 3 or top 5 in terms of strength of schedule remaining. Last I checked, I think the Bucks were somewhere around 10th or 11th. Yeah. So that is quite a difference from what we were talking about for basically every single day of the last month. You're still in a relatively good spot, is I suppose the way that I would frame it is you haven't clinched anything, but you're in a good spot. And I've referenced playoff status quite a bit. They've been pretty accurate the last few years when we've referenced it here. They have the Bucks with a 90% chance to finish no lower than 3rd in the East and a 72% chance to finish 2nd, which is leaps and bounds ahead of any other team that's out there. The Cavaliers are next with a 16% chance, and they actually give the Orlando Magic a higher percent chance of finishing 2nd than they do the New York Knicks. So I suppose when we mention the 2-game separation there in the loss column, the easiest way to look at it is always, okay, if we do this, here's what the teams chasing us would have to do. And the Bucks, as we just pointed to, the schedule has some challenges. There are some caveats to that we'll get to in just a second here. But let's just say the Bucks go 5-5 in these final 10 games. I think they're going to perform better than that, but let's set the baseline at 5-5. 5 home games, 5 road games. If you do that, it means if the Cavaliers go 7-3, they would pass you. If the Knicks go 7-3, you have the tiebreaker over the Knicks. You would still finish in front of the Knicks. The Magic, I believe, would need to go 9-2 to catch the Bucks, but they have 2 games left against the Bucks. You look at the schedule that's left for the Cavaliers too. 76ers. Now, Joel Embiid is not going to be back in that game, but there's a couple of big matchups on Easter Sunday, and one of them is the Cavaliers in Denver to take on the Nuggets. It is part of a 5-game road trip that starts in Denver, goes to Utah, and Bucks fans will be the first to tell you, hey, it's not as easy as it sounds to play and win in Utah. Then they go to Phoenix to play a Suns team that is still fighting for their playoff lives in terms of staying out of the play-in tournament. And they wrap up that road trip with 2 games in Los Angeles against the Lakers and the Clippers. And the Lakers, again, trying to get out of the play-in tournament. Clippers are trying to hold on to home court advantage in a 4-5 matchup with the Pelicans. Then they wrap it up with fairly winnable games. The Memphis Grizzlies, Charlotte Hornets, and the Indiana Pacers sandwiched in between there, which could be a very important game for the Pacers when we talk about playoff seeding. So as you look at this on paper, to me, it seems like that, and I know it by the numbers and opponent win percentage, it is not. Cavaliers are currently 20th in terms of opponent win percentage on their remaining schedule. Bucks are 11th. But to me, that seems like a much more difficult schedule remaining than what the Bucks have. Because I'll say this, and then I've talked too long. I'll let you finish it off, Camille. Some of those Bucks challenges, I think the biggest game they have left is against the New York Knicks on April 7th. You have the Celtics. Boston's already clinched the 1 seed. Who knows who they're even going to play in that game in the final week of the regular season. The Oklahoma City Thunder, maybe it's not to the levels of the Celtics. That's their penultimate game. Maybe they've clinched and locked into their seed. So who knows who you'll see there. The 2 games against the Magic could potentially be very interesting because that's your 3rd to last and final game of the season. But again, things may be sorted out by then. So I think the fact that the Bucks, their challenges come later on the schedule is actually a much more favorable thing, to the point where I would almost say, I'd rather have the Bucks schedule than the Cavs.
That's one way to look at it. And you have to keep in mind too, Justin, as we saw against the LeBron-less Lakers, that just because you might be facing a team not at full strength, It does not mean that victory is guaranteed, although we feel it should be assured. So when you broke it down really well, especially the Boston matchup to end the season, as well as Oklahoma City, because when you're looking at the Bucks schedule, Pelicans Thursday night today, as you're listening to this, toughest road game on this trip. You go New Orleans, then you go to Atlanta, and then you go to Washington. None of those are back-to-backs. You get a day off in between each. You come home, have 5 straight games at home, and we know the Bucks, how they play at home. One of the best home teams in the NBA. Although they did just lose to the Lakers at home, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. That's in the past now. We're moving on to the future. And with that, at home, you're going to be seeing Memphis, Toronto, New York, Boston, Orlando. And those first 2 games, Memphis and Toronto, those are two teams right there where it's like
Season's
playoffs, like it's not happening for us this season. So it's not to say that those guys won't be out there trying to play, because a lot of times in those games, it's younger guys trying to say like, hey, I deserve to be in the NBA. Like, I can bring something to a team. Look at me. If it's not going to be Memphis, not Toronto, like NBA, like look at what I can do. So those can be showcase games for other teams who don't have much to play for in regards to the standings and the playoffs, but they have something personal that they're playing for. So you can't overlook them, but this is the Bucks team, as we've been hearing, that's really looking to gear up for the playoffs. And we know their kryptonite throughout the season has been playing against sub 500 competition. The Bucks have all season under Griff, under Doc. They show up in the big marquee matchups. They're ready to go, but we have seen some slippage in those games against teams that aren't in the playoff hunt, aren't in the race, or teams that you're saying, like, looking on paper, this is a team the Bucks should beat. So this is going to be a nice challenge, I think, for the Bucks going into the playoffs, where you're looking to be playing your best basketball. You're looking to be continually building good habits. And we've heard Doc mention it about how do you get better at, your switching? How do you get better at communication? How do you get better and more comfortable in the offensive system with the 2-man game with Giannis and Dame, with the 3-man game incorporating Chris? And it's reps, it's habits, it's practice. So within that, like, definitely want to get the wins. You do not get me wrong, but I want to see the process looking really good as we head into the playoffs, given that it's 10 games left. I don't really care who the opponent is. The process has to be good in every single game here on out, because we are ramping up for that playoff push, and it's not the time to slack down. Like we heard Doc Rivers mention, this is the time where I'm looking to ramp up minutes at this point. So like, I don't want to get to the playoffs and guys have to go out there and play 40, 42 minutes and they're winded because they're only used to playing 30. So it'll be interesting to see how the Bucks play it as well, if that's what they're looking to do, and also trying to get as many reps as they can. Like, it'll be interesting when we get to the end of this schedule at Oklahoma City, against Orlando at home, against Orlando on the road. Like, are the Bucks going to be sitting people? Like, or are they going to be playing and trying to get as many reps in as they can under their new head coach? How long can you call him newest head coach for this team, and getting those reps in and trying to build? So it'll be interesting to see how the Bucks approach this. But to your point about where they finish in the standings, I think that 3 seed is probably the lowest that we would see them drop, but I feel pretty good about them being able to maintain that spot in the 2 seed, especially with the Knicks coming up. That's like a double game where it's like we're playing someone who's chasing us. So we can get a win and knock them back at the same time. It helps out a lot. So it'll be a fun sprint to the playoffs here. It's just assuming health. That's all I want. I want a healthy Bucks team heading into the playoffs and good process.
Yeah, you win that game against the Knicks on April 7th. And by the way, any fans that come to the game, no WrestleMania spoilers that night for me. But you win that game on April 7th, and it's done. The Knicks are not catching you. If they win, though, it's an entirely different conversation. I think I don't remember if it was on this show or another one. I misspoke and said the Bucks had only played the Magic once. I'm not even going to pretend like, oh yeah, I forgot about this. I did not remember that second game against Orlando at all, just before Christmas when the Bucks beat them. So that series is even at a game apiece. So those 2 games could potentially decide the tiebreaker should you finish tied with the Magic there. And that's to me, the interesting team is the Magic, because they have 2 games left against the Bucks. Cavs are dealing with a whole lot of health issues right now. Knicks have a pretty uphill climb to get past the Bucks, and they have to win that game on April 7th if they're going to catch the Bucks. The Magic, though, when you look at the game starting this weekend, home against the Clippers, who not a free fall, but they have not been the Clippers that we saw for December and January. And it really kind of started with that win the Bucks had over them. The Memphis Grizzlies and Portland Trailblazers, who are out of it. And the Magic have not been one of those teams that have struggled against the bad teams. And you have the Charlotte Hornets on the schedule. So that, to me, is the interesting one, is the Orlando Magic. And we mentioned those odds of, hey, this team actually has a better % chance of finishing second than the Knicks do. And I think that's the reason why. When you look at the teams that are left on their schedule, even the good teams that they have outside of the Bucks, they don't have elite teams that are left on their schedule. When you think about playoff teams, it's not teams that are in the top 2 or 3, except for those 2 games they have left against the Bucks. So that's the interesting one to monitor. But I'm with you. I think the Bucks are going to end up finishing second now because of the injuries and struggles we've seen from the Cavs. And again, if you go 5-5, it's not a lock, but it's 85, 90% sure if we go 5-5, the math is on our side that we'll get the 1 or the 2 seed, I beg your pardon. And to me, the big part of it, Camille, is you mentioned parts of that schedule and the start of the homestand. It's the 4 games in a row that they have: Saturday in Atlanta against the Hawks, Tuesday, April 2nd in DC against the Wizards, and then the first 2 games of the homestand, the Memphis Grizzlies and the Toronto Raptors. The Wizards and Grizzlies, that is a back-to-back. But those 4 games, and I've pointed to these for a while now, those are the 4 important ones, because you understand there's challenges on the schedule, but those are 4 you should really point to and say, hey, we should, and we got to win these games.
Take care of business.
Yeah. And if you win those 4 games, that means you just got to win one other game of your remaining, 6 after that to get to that 5-5 threshold. That if you can take care of business in those 4 games, I think that basically is a lock that the Bucks would be the 2 seed.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. But the guy that starts against the Pelicans. It starts against the Pelicans, who are without Brandon Ingram themselves. So it's not a fully loaded Pelicans team either. And it's one of those games like you want to try to go into New Orleans and steal one. But I'm sure the Pelicans remember the last time they saw the Bucks, and they are looking for their get back as well. So nothing's going to be given. They got to go and execute, especially after losing against the Lakers in the fashion that they did, where you see the ball start to stick a bit more as the game goes on, seeing them trust the process, move the ball. Again, you want to see the process good, and hopefully they can start this upcoming 3-game road trip with the win.
We'll take a look at that matchup with the Pelicans and some interesting quirks to this schedule as we close things out. Doc Rivers had something to say about that as well. We'll take a look at that coming up after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, no matter what kind of work you do, how you communicate is key. All those emails, reports, presentations, they're all equally important to the collaboration needed to get things done. And Grammarly can help. Grammarly is your AI writing partner to help you communicate more effectively and efficiently so you can make a bigger impact at work. 96% of Grammarly users report that Grammarly helps them craft more impactful writing, because Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites. By understanding your writing and context, Grammarly provides relevant, personalized suggestions. Their tone suggestions help you navigate even the most difficult work conversations. So save time with one click and go from editing drafts in hours to seconds. 93% of professionals using Grammarly Premium report that it helps them get more work done. Grammarly is the gold standard of responsible AI with 14 years of experience and just about every IT certification under the sun. Grammarly is a secure AI writing partner that helps your team make their point and move faster. So make a bigger impact at work with Grammarly. Sign up and download for free at Grammarly.com/podcast. That's Grammarly, Grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. All right, Camille, it is a interesting schedule, not just for the Bucks, for a lot of teams as we close out the regular season here. It really started with those games against the Oklahoma City Thunder. The Bucks had gone, I think, 16 months without playing the Thunder. Both games were very early in the season. I think they wrapped in November last year, and now both games very late in the season this year. I talked about playing the Magic earlier in the season, both those games, November and December, and now you close out with two of your final three games against the Magic, where both those teams are very different from the first times that they faced off. Even to a lesser extent, that matchup with the New Orleans Pelicans, too, feels like a lifetime ago that you played New Orleans in the end of January when Joe Prunty was coaching, I think that was his final game as the interim head coach of the Bucks. So a lot has changed for those teams. And Doc Rivers talked about it with the Lakers and their media last night too, that they're embarking on this lengthy road trip all on the East Coast. And as he said, I don't ever remember a year like this where you have so many East to West matchups this late in the season, and not just one-offs, but actual road trips that usually when you get to this point in the schedule, you're playing divisional and at least conference teams, very heavy slate of your action going into the playoffs.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that just has to do with how they are scheduling arenas now as well, just with so many more events coming to basketball arenas and trying to book around these things. Like we already know how the Clippers and Lakers always have their annual long road trip every single year.
Yeah.
The Spurs have one, I believe, too, for the rodeo, where it's like they're just going to be gone for a while. And you understand that every year, but as more events and more programming is coming to these buildings, and now it's more competition for the dates. I wonder how much of that has an effect on it as well, because it's just like, it's strange, like you mentioned, to be going east to west this late in the season. And I never really even thought too much about that until I was listening to you speak about what Doc was saying. And I was like, that does feel right. Like now that I think about it, seeing OKC like this late in the year does feel somewhat strange. Memphis as well. Although I think we saw Memphis late last year or recently as well, but something different in the scheduling that they gotta get used to here with this one and in the season strong. So with that being said about the travel, and I know how big of a headache travel is, and there's always, of course, the people who are like, well, 20 years ago, they didn't even have the private. I understand. We're talking on the scale in regards to just what travel does on the body in this current landscape. And we know how difficult that can be. So I do enjoy the fact that the Bucks have the 5 straight games at home. It sucks they have to end on the road, but if they are that top 2 seed, well, it doesn't really matter because you're going to play in tournament first anyway. So you're going to get a couple of days off after finishing up the regular season on the road to kind of be at home, adjust. If they're a 2 seed, try to figure out who you're playing. If you're a 3 seed, already starting to prepare for your matchup. So just got to take care of their bodies, be smart. And Doc's mentioned it before as well, like he wants his heroes in May and June. Like this is not the time for it. So take care of the bodies, prepare for it, and at least thank the play-in tournament for a couple of days off before the playoffs start.
Well, the next time we have a non-post-game show, Camille, we'll at least have 2 more games crossed off the list. So just 8 games will remain for the Bucks. And again, depending on the help that you get, you could potentially be 4 games up on those teams that are chasing you, and 4 games with 8 remaining, pretty close to calling it at that point. But we should have a better idea of at least our confidence in where the Bucks are going to finish in terms of their seed. Now, in terms of who they're going to play, I don't think that is going to be resolved until the final week and final day probably of the regular season, when you factor in, as we mentioned, the separation and how slim it is between Bucks, Cavs, Knicks, and Magic, as that's your 2 through 5. We know those teams are going to finish 2 through 5 and in some order to be determined. We know the Celtics are 1. I think we know the Hawks and the Bulls are going to be 10 and 9. And then the big parts are just 2 through 5, who finishes where with those teams, and 6, 7, 8. I think we know at this point it's going to be Indy, Miami, and Philly. So again, who finishes where? Those teams are separated by 1 game in the loss column. So this is something that is very much going to go down to at least the final weekend. So we haven't had much discussion over, well, who would you rather have, or who do you think the Bucks are going to get, because it's pointless at this point with how much movement we're going to see for these next 10 days, essentially. So we'll have a better idea of that in the final week of the regular season. We'll be back with the post-game show tomorrow night, later tonight, depending on when you listen to it, for the Bucks and the New Orleans Pelicans. So hopefully a bounce-back performance, but again, one that the Bucks will have to do without Pat Beverley. So we'll see what the backup point guard situation looks like in that one. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.